Good morning. My name is Marcia Stromgren, and you've tuned in to Just the Facts. I have in the studio this morning Art Johnston, former school board member. Welcome, Art.
Hi, Marcia. Great to be here as usual.
Good to have you again. We just got done with an election cycle, and unfortunately, the good ones that we would like to have seen get on the board to make some good changes didn't get elected. But you and I have been talking a little bit about, because you called me with a question about this undervoting. Not that we have ever seen this issue before, but let's just talk about it briefly. It turns out that what undervoting is when someone goes to the polls and they have a choice to make in a category, such as, for instance, the at-large seat had 4 contenders, so you needed to vote for up to 2. Some people chose to vote for 1, which, you know what, that's their right. It's up to them whether they want to choose somebody that they know and they trust and not choose somebody that they don't know and may not trust. But there seems to have been a little bit of a conversation about this in the newspaper, like there's something wrong with those people that only voted for one person in the at-large city council race. What's your thoughts on that, Art?
Well, it was in the Duluth News Tribune, so I should say something, but I found it very ironic that they decided to report on undervoting. There's been undervoting ever since there's been voting. And I went back and looked at the other elections. They've always been there. You always add up the things, like when I got elected. And when I didn't get elected, there's always been about 10-15% of the people that don't vote for a particular candidate. And so this is nothing new. So the Duluth News Tribune actually wrote this as this is something amazingly new. What is different, and I don't know why the clerks did this, but they actually did put down the underreporting. You can go back and add up the numbers anytime in any election, and you'll know that there's lots of undervoting. And it's always been that way, always has been. So this is a complete non-issue. It's really kind of silly because people do have a right to vote whether or not they want. They don't. People that go in, and we'll talk about how many people vote, which is very pathetically low. This is a real issue, is a low voter turnout. But people that vote, say 28% of the people that are registered voters decide to vote. Well, they have a right to take that ballot. They can vote for nobody on it. They can just stick it in the machine, and there's no votes on it, or they can vote for whoever they want. And I think it's actually good to see people not voting. The paper made it sound like, and the city clerk made it sound like this was some nefarious thing going on. No, people have a right not to vote. And I think, for example, votes or elections that nobody knows anything about, like say judges, for example, undervoting is very, very high, and those sometimes I think up to 50%. Because why should somebody vote for somebody they don't know who it is? And I think that shows some integrity by the voters that they don't vote because, hey, they don't want to vote for somebody they don't know who it is. And I would assume the same reason. I don't know why people undervoted. All I can say, well, I undervoted. For example, the city council race, you could vote for up to 2 people. And I wasn't going to vote for anybody that we all know in elections in America and probably everywhere in the world, that you don't vote for somebody, you vote against somebody. There's very few people that run for political office that we want as neighbors, want to be in-laws or dating our sons and daughters. Most politicians, we don't want that. And we can talk about that in just a minute too, the poor opinion that people have of politicians as a rule. So I think it's good when people don't vote because there isn't anybody there they want to vote for, so why should they vote? I say, right on for people that don't vote. I mean, I only voted for 1 city council person because there wasn't anybody else on there worth voting for. And In this case, I did vote for the one person who did end up winning because he was a good guy. He came across as a common person, somebody that you would like to have as a neighbor, somebody you would appreciate buying business or giving business to at his stores that contributes to our community. And there was nobody else on that ballot that did that. So I voted for one person, as did I counted up about 10%, only about 10% of the people didn't vote for two. It wasn't very many. I was surprised that many people did vote for two people that they did. There was about 10,000 people voted and about 22,000 people did not vote for two people. So, somewhere, 10, 20%. I don't have the numbers because I didn't run the numbers on that one, but it was quite high. And remember, the people that did won, they only got about, up around the 28% of the vote. And 10% of the people didn't vote. So that says something. It says something. What it says is not what the newspaper made it see or what the city clerk made it sound like some nefarious thing. What it says that there's people, I think, in Duluth that are aware that the people that are running for office are not worth voting for.
Don't represent them once they get into office. They are politicians who speak a line, but that's about all they do is speak a line. Let's go to the city clerk's statement in the latest News Tribune article that the voters don't know who the candidates are. Well, I have my thoughts on that, and I know you have yours as well, but I'm going to say this. Some of our voters are illiterate. That's part of the problem. Some of them are, like you say, they don't want to vote for people who, first of all, they don't know anything about. And whose responsibility is that? There are very few forums where all candidates are invited. There are very few articles in the Duluth News Tribune, the only paper in town, which, by the way, we'll talk about that briefly here, referring to one of the candidates who won and wasn't even put on the front page. Does that say anything to you about the newspaper's credibility in the eyes of a lot of people who are no longer purchasing the Duluth News Tribune? They aren't credible. And not to uphold a candidate who had won fair and square, but the newspaper made it look like, well, he was in with this group of people and they all said to their supporters in that group, well, be sure you only vote for this candidate and don't vote for the others. So then the newspaper makes it sound like they did something wrong. I mean, the whole newspaper picture that we have in Duluth is pathetic, to say the least. And then to have the city clerk say, well, because the voters didn't know who the candidates were, whose fault is that?
Well, you bring up a good point, and she is correct in the fact that people did not know that. The whole thing about the Duluth News Tribune thinking this is some kind of a noteworthy thing is not noteworthy at all. People didn't vote because they didn't want to vote for
Exactly.
these people, period.
Right.
And okay, what can we do about that? I think it is a real problem. We live in a democracy, like it or not. The majority of the person that gets the majority votes, or of not the majority, the actual the most votes that are cast, which is never the majority of the voters, but the most that are cast, they are the ones that win elections almost everywhere. So when somebody doesn't vote, there's two. Well, let's take for the people that vote because they didn't. Let's assume that the city clerk is correct. I think she is in saying that there isn't much information out there. Whose fault is that? It's certainly not the voters' fault. It's the media's fault. The Duluth News Tribune is pathetic. The voter turnout, there is this time around, and as far as I know, there was 2 forums. One was the Duluth News Tribune. They did endorse people. They didn't even interview those people. They just took from some of they had a forum. That forum was not televised. It was not recorded. Nobody knows what was even said. There was very few people that even showed up to it. The other people that talk about voters is the League of Women Voters. Now in Duluth, as well as most places around the country, League of Women Voters is partisan. Even though they say they're not, all you got to do is look at the paper, do any kind of search on the League of Women Voters, and they're an ultra-partisan group. So most people aren't going to waste their time going to a League of Women Voters because they know they're going to get biased information. I've been at many of their forums. I've been on, again, I was elected twice. I went through all these things. Of course, I go to these things, but the questions are lame. They do not reflect the people. They reflect partisan outlook. So I don't know what to do about that, Marcia. It is a fault of the media. I would like to throw out, well, a couple things. First of all, is this is not just in Duluth. It's a problem, in the world. I think it is though, I think more prevalent in Duluth. Personally, I think Duluth political system is on the line. It is dysfunctional, it is corrupt, as bad as Chicago, as bad as Detroit. That's my opinion, and I hope people that listen to this complain about that. I'd like to have somebody take me on that. But we see how politics works in there. We had 32% of the vote. We have, the last election I was in, there was 28% of the vote. And so I think it's by design that there is no forums. There is no information put out on candidates. There's no place to put, the Duluth News Tribune didn't even have a column from candidates this time. They did have their endorsements, but that was it. The forum, they called it a forum, wasn't even televised, it wasn't even recorded, so nobody has a clue what anybody even talked about. The League of Women Voters things are not recorded, they by design. So you don't have any information out there on candidates. I think I'd like to point out this. I think it's very ironic that when we have national elections, like we had 3 years ago, and presidential elections, voter turnout this time was 32%, which is actually one of the higher they call it off-cycle elections. With last election I was in, we had 28% of the people, the registered voters, voted. On a presidential election back in 2016, was 80%. I'm just bringing this up because where do people get their news? You sit up there, and I'm going to assume most people watch TV or go on the website or do Google searches or go on Facebook, wherever they get their news nowadays. And about the only news you're going to get off the web is news about the national elections, national politics. And consequently, you have 80% of the people vote because everybody's heard of Donald Trump, everybody's heard of Hillary Clinton, so people are going to go out and vote. So to me, when you have these off elections where you have 28% of the people voting versus 80, that's really an indictment of small town media. I know small town media can't compete with Google and Facebook. We all know that's a big issue. It would actually be fun to do research if I had the time to do it. I think elections 40 years ago had much higher turnouts for local elections versus national elections. Why? Because back in those days, there was actually, most people had local newspapers. Yeah, we got the Duluth News Tribune, but hey, we all know the Duluth News Tribune is pathetic.
It's the only paper in town, so to
But
speak.
back in the old days, even small towns, a lot of small town papers have went out because they can't compete with the internet. So there isn't any news done on local things. Nobody knows anything about local issues. I've read, that a lot of school board issues, you may have 10 or 15% of the eligible voters voting for them. And that is certainly, I would think if you went back and looked 40 years ago, you're going to have a lot higher voter turnout for mayor elections, city council mayor. Again, this time we had 32. 2 years ago it was 28. That's really pathetic because these are the people that are running our city.
Our communities.
And
Yeah.
and everybody looks at the news, all you're going to think the only politics there are out there is national politics. And I think it's really sad that nobody takes the effort. And I'm to blame. I've ran for office. In the last election I was in, 28% of the people voted. That's certainly, I have to take blame for that myself because I did not get my word out good enough. I was not able to convince more than 28% of the people to get out and vote at all. So I'm certainly part to blame for that. I think we have to go back. And in Duluth, we do have a newspaper. We do have a lot of civic groups, and yet there is virtually nothing about elections, except when when the presidential election, you're going to see all kinds of ads. TVs are full of ads. Nobody on small town elections, I'll take Duluth a small town like school boards. The only people that have money are those that are endorsed by either the political party, which is supposed to be nonpartisans, but I think we want to talk about, or by the unions. One of the candidates this time around, even though it was only 32% voter turnout, I got 5 flyers in the mail, big flyers, with her picture on it. And I don't know who paid for it, but I got, over the election cycle, a month before the election, I got 5 of these. Each one of those flyers, I've done flyers too. I can't afford very many. I can't afford 5. Each flyer is anywhere between $5,000 and $10,000 to get a flyer out.
Right. Yeah.
And it's expensive, and most people, they can't afford that unless they're being endorsed by a special interest group. I'll go back to my statement that I think Duluth is among one of the more corrupt cities politically. Why? Because it's being ran by special interest groups, being ran by the unions, being ran by the DFL party, and I think it does not reflect the best interests of the people, and that is why people don't bother to go out and vote. It's not because they're ignorant, not because they can't read, not because they don't read the instructions on the ballot, is they don't want to vote because they know it's a waste of time. And I know we're not supposed to say that as Americans because our democracy is supposed to be the model in the world, right? Well, the reality is that it's not. The model is that, give you some data that I picked up before I came in. This is a Pew Research Center. This was back in 2015, so it's a little bit dated. It's certainly gotten worse than that. And it shows that both political parties, Republicans and Democrats, they have only a 36% confidence in political wisdom of their political parties, 37%. Another part of that survey was elected officials are totally out of touch and they're self-interested. That's why they're elected. They're not interested. They don't get elected because they want to make Duluth a better city, to make our schools a better city. They're interested because they're self-interested in winning elections. And according to this is again Pew Research Center, is that 74% of the people think that politicians don't care what the voter thinks. 74% do not think that politicians care about them at all. This was before the whole fiasco on the national level going on right now. I would say the percent right now is probably closer to 85%. 74% say that politicians put their own interests first, not the interests of Duluth, not the interests of the public schools, not the interests of their communities, but themselves. 77% think that people quickly lose contact with them, even if they maybe had ideals. Once they get elected, they lose those ideals and they suddenly only vote for their own self-interest, not the interest of the community. And I think we can see that nowadays it's rampant. Nobody talks about the goodness of the community. It's all about identity politics. They're talking about shaming people. And they talk about, like the city clerk trying to shame people because they didn't vote. Well, there's a reason people don't vote. And I think it's a politician's fault. Politicians should have the highest moral ethical standards. We know they don't. They know their self-interest. I'm sure there's some politicians that are out there, and I will go on a limb and say that I was one of them. I got elected twice, and everybody said, I really like you because you don't change. You haven't pandered to special interest groups. Of course, that's one reason I lost the third time too.
You were vilified in the media.
Oh, well, of course, the Duluth News Tribune went after me
Right.
with a vengeance.
Right.
And of course, the DFL hated me, the unions hated me, even though I'm a big union supporter, which I think we've talked about before. I'm very proud of being a union person. But yet they went after me, and nowadays you can see it time after time after time. I was one of the first ones that were part of the cancel culture, they call them. They go after somebody and to try to destroy them. But hey, this is not about me. Our discussions aren't about me. It's about politicians do not have their public interest at mind. And people know that. People are not stupid. I think people are smart. There's a reason they don't go out and vote, because they know, what's the point? We're going to have a corrupt city. Duluth, again, I'll go back to my statement, we're one of the more corrupter cities, I think, in the country. And why? Because we have no local reporting. The Duluth News Tribune doesn't report on anything. In that whole article, nobody talked about how 28% of the people voted.
No, they just made a big deal out of undervoting, and it's like, we've never seen this reported before. All of a sudden, we're using that as a way to write articles and, like you say, making statements to make people feel bad that they didn't do the right thing by voting for two people. Like, they don't have a mind of their own. They don't have a right to do that. They're just supposed to do what the port bill is. How do you say that word? Port bolo? Anyway,
Yeah.
It's what they call it in Russia.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, the politicians are telling you what you should do, when you should do it, and how you should do it, and be sure you send your money for us. I received some of the literature. However, I don't live in the city, so I don't have to deal with the mayor and the council and any of that. But I do have to vote for a school district, and I got 3 pieces of literature, color, the whole bit, and I know what the cost is because I did a research on that. So how many thousands of dollars were put into those 3 pieces of literature to vote for these candidates, which are endorsed by the DFL and the union? Now let's go to that issue, because that's what we were originally going to talk about, and that is endorsing school district, city council, and county commissioners, which are supposed to be nonpartisan races. So why are they being allowed to do that? Because at one time they were not allowed to do it. Now you have some information that you told me about that I'd like you to share with our viewers about that.
Well, first of all, this is a free country. We have freedom of speech, and people can endorse whoever they want. And so I think it's, I want to, whatever I'm going to say here, that has to be a preemblem. People can support, they can throw money at candidates, as bad as we may think it is. The Supreme Court has ruled that people can throw all the money they want on politics, and it is a free country. And I think, personally, I think we'd be going down a slippery slope if we say that people can't do that. But having said that, I think a lot of political people I think there's some people that did have the public interest in mind, and this was acknowledged by the state of Minnesota. Let me just talk you some of the details on that. Minnesota Statute 200, Subdivision 28 states, and I'm quoting, nonpartisan offices means all judiciary, county, municipal, school district, and special district offices. It's very clear that nonpartisan offices are things that we just mentioned. The only partisan offices are federal elections and state office. Everything else, like school boards, school city councils, county elections, are nonpartisan by Minnesota law. And just to get a little bit of history on this statute was amended and repassed as part of the Senate Files 455 on May 22nd, 2015. This was a very recent addition. And it was by a unanimous vote, a 65-0 in the Senate and 131-0 in the House. It's probably one of the only things next to the Timber Jay bill that was passed unanimously by the House, and that was 2015. Things were getting pretty hyper-partisan at that point. So the political people, even the political people who have a stake, know that things like city council meetings and school boards should not be political. But yet, we know the political parties do it. Now, I don't have good research on this, but as far as I understand, the only political parties, areas where political parties endorse are in Duluth and in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And it's mainly for school board elections and occasionally for city council. Why do these people want to do that? Well, I think it's wrong. And to remind your viewers, I was on the Duluth, the DFL executive board in Senate District 7 for many years. One of the things I tried to get them to not to endorse partisan races, not to endorse in nonpartisan races. Why? Because it's pitting people against each other. That should not be. And I think it's very problematic from a democracy to take things that are declared by law to be nonpartisan, but yet for the partisans to jump in. And why do they do that? I'll tell you why they do it. One, because they have to keep their base fired up. They want to have an election every 2 years, so people people get fired up. They get on the phone banks and say, "Oh my gosh, you have to vote for this person for city council." Because why? Not because they're supposed to be nonpartisan, even though the convention endorsed them, but they want to keep it. If they don't have a convention every 2 years, people are going to lose interest in political parties. And they want to keep that going, so they make up stuff. In this case, they make up issues like city councils or school board things. And I think it's a very big disservice. I don't know, political parties are a little bit different from, they're a different political animal. I don't know legally, I don't know if they're violating some laws. We know they're nonpartisan, but does that mean that political parties political parties are actually codified by the state? There's certainly political parties there. And since they're codified by the state, is it violating the law? I wish somebody would contest that. It should be a violation of law, I think, but it's not. Now, other places, though, like labor unions, they're not a political party, and they have a right to endorse anybody they want. And not just political parties. For example, BizPac, which I think was when we talked about the Duluth News Tribune and their scoop on that the BizPac was telling people only vote for one. Well, this has happened forever. Political parties tell their people to vote for one people if they're on a when you can vote for two. That's always been that way.
But to endorse them with literature.
Well, the political parties, that's another thing. But getting back to that, it's the unions probably have a right to endorse who they want, as does a BizPac, as does a Chamber of Commerce. But hey, in Duluth, the Chamber of Commerce they're right in bed with the unions and with the Duluth News Tribune. They're all the same. There's no difference in Duluth. They're all the same. But it is a free country. I think freedom of speech is going to allow people like the unions, BizPac, the Chamber of Commerce, and the union. There's many unions, of course, in Duluth. There's probably 50 unions in Duluth, but I'm a union supporter. So they do have a right to do it, but I think it is problematic. And who paid for all the literature we got on nonpartisan races? The DFL paid for some of them, because once they get endorsed by the convention, then they get money from the state DFL. So I think it is something that should be looked at. I think it's ethically wrong for political parties to be endorsing a nonpartisan races, particularly with the strong outpouring of even politicians who said that these should not be partisan races. They should be based on the merit of the person, not whether or not they suck up to some political party or some union or not. And that's what they do. We know everybody that does it. They have to suck up the people that sent out the the lady sent out the 5 flyers. That had to have been $30,000, $40,000. And I haven't looked at the election reports, but I think it's kind of obscene to have, in a small city like Duluth, to have somebody spending so much money on something that there was really no difference between these candidates anyway. I thought it was kind of sad. But they should be nonpartisan. There's another aspect of that, which I don't know a lot about, but I've heard people talk about the city charter. Says that these are also nonpartisan races. And yet, everybody seems to poo-hoo that. And in this case, the political party that runs Duluth is the DFL, so of course they poo-hoo it. In other places, with the Republicans ran, I'm sure it would be the same, then the Republicans would be poo-hooing it. But it would be nice if people took the spirit of the law, spirit of the charter, the spirit of the Minnesota election law, and made these nonpartisan races. And it would force people to actually talk about issues rather than a bunch of partisan claptrap, which is what political parties are, just claptrap.
Well, I've been there and done that, so I understand that one. But I am going to say this. Back when Ness was running, I don't know if it was his first or second time running, I was going over to the Members Co-op Credit Union, which is now the site of the Whole Foods Co-op in Duluth. And on the ground, I do this, I pick up litter all over the place. I try to make my city look decent. So I bent over to pick up this literature and I flipped it over, and here was Mayor Ness and school board county races on this little flyer. And it says, take this to the polls and vote for these people. It was supported by the DFL. And I, right then and there, that was so many years ago now, thought, these are nonpartisan races, and yet the DFL is telling their people who they should be voting for, and make sure you bring it to the polls so you don't forget who you need to do our bidding of. So I think it's obnoxious, but I also was in a meeting where a woman read from the city charter and challenged the now Mayor Larson, second term, on that issue. And I very clearly, and I have had this confirmed, heard her say, it's all in interpretation. Now, if an elected city official, the highest one in the city of Duluth, is able to stand up there in front of a crowd, and there was a large group of people there at that meeting, and say, it's all in interpretation, then as a politician, she's basically saying, I can make or break the laws of this charter. It makes no difference because I'll interpret it the way I want it. And that is a good reason why a lot of people are disgusted with politics. I know for a fact that I left the Republican Party back in the 90s because of the shenanigans that I saw going on there. And so I'm not the only one that has been turned off by politicians. It would be nice to see some statesmen. Statesmen are people who tell you what they're going to do, whether you like it or not. I mean, you may not agree with them, but they hold to what the rules are, and that sometimes makes people uncomfortable that want to break the rules. But they say what they're going to do and they do it. A politician tells you anything you want to hear, and they go right behind your back and either do the opposite thing or something else.
Well, it's even worse. It's worse than that, Marcia, because politicians have power.
Yes, they
like
do.
it or not, they have power.
Yes.
In our society, in our country, and every other country. So when they interpret the law, like Mayor Larson interpreted the law, I think that's very typical. We interpret it as meaning this. Okay. And she also has a lot of power because she runs a lot of political stuff here. She collects millions of dollars in taxes. I forget how much money, $40 million that are collected in taxes that she's in charge of. And she can interpret the rules how she wants. And I would like to think that Mayor Larson has very high ethical standards. Maybe she does. I don't know her personally. But I think that as we've seen on the national level now, most politicians do not have any standards at all. So I think when people say they want to interpret it, and political people, it's a question I think we talked about earlier, is who goes into politics? That's one of the problems we've got. We've already talked about how 77% of the people do not think they're representing the people's interests. I mean, that's a fact. People, and certainly around the world. So why do people go into politics? Go into politics because they get power. I've been part of the federal government. I was an employee there. And wasn't elected, of course. I was appointed because, hey, I'm an engineer. We had work to do. But a lot of people that I work with think that they're part of a government. They have privilege. The other people don't. They can start interpreting things how they want. They can take their own personal agenda and take it to their job. And that's rampant in any kind of government. And of course, in elected people, you take it one step farther, they are elected. And they can interpret things how they want. And again, who goes into to be a politics? People go into politics. Maybe it's an innate human condition that most people like to have power over other people. I don't know. I don't feel that way, but I think it's probably, some people would say it's probably an innate human condition. And those people that feel strongly about that, they're attracted to things like politics. And they go into politics, so they can exert their power and have power over other people. Sometimes that's very nefarious. Sometimes it may be good. But I think we've seen many times, I could give you many, many examples that the people that exert their power is for nefarious reasons. There are personal reasons. They don't like somebody, they go after them. And all the stuff you hear in the polls, the Pew research polls show very clear that the politicians do not out there for the best interests of the country. They're out there for their own interest. And unfortunately, those people are attracted to politics. And once they get elected, it's insidious because they want to keep that power. They go, well, look at that. I can go behind the scenes. I can get somebody fired, or I can make sure they don't get hired, or I can shame them publicly, or I can raise their taxes. That happens. Everybody knows that happens. And if anybody that denies that doesn't have a clue what's going on in the world. Maybe that's a human condition. I think we have to acknowledge that. Politicians should acknowledge that they are there to exert power over other people. Of course, that is a system. That is what politics is there for, is exert power over other people. It's not for the good of society. We do have to have political systems. We know we have to have people running things like the police force, the building highways, the national defense. But that now encompasses virtually every aspect of our life. And I think the same people are still going into politics. Those that want to exert power, that thrive on having power and telling somebody else to try to destroy somebody else. That is what politicians do. We can see nationally, it's obvious. And it's sad. But I think we have to know that. Can we elect people that don't want to do that? I was elected for 8 years, and people call me up on the phone and say, hey, Mr. Johnston, hey, you're a smart politician. Can you do this for me? Can you do that for me? And I get that all the time. I mean, that's what I got. I mean, and I tried to, things that I had no interest on, or I had no authority over, which is most things, I would tell people, no, I can't do that. But people think that you're elected, you can do that. They expect people to do that. And when I wasn't elected anymore and decided, I'm not a politician anymore, thank goodness, because there's a bunch of nasty people that are in politics, nobody called me up anymore. And to me, that's fine because I'm basically an introvert, even though people laugh at me when I say that. I really don't want I don't want to run people's lives. I want them to be able to take care of themselves, to be able to be resourceful, use our society, use the resources we have as society, and make a living for themselves, for their family, for their community. I don't want some politician up there telling me what to do. But unfortunately, nobody calls me up anymore. I think that's good, but I'm just saying that people in
Get
our
more done that
society,
way.
they expect that of politicians, there's a major shift is needed in politics in America to stop politicians from saying being out there for their self-interest, instead talking about for the good of the country. And of course, you're going to say it. I remember when I was on the school board, the MSB, they did polls, and they said they polled school board members that 90% of them were there for the children. How many times am I going to laugh about that, Marcy? But people actually believe that, and that is pure BS. They're not there for the children. They're there to get power. They're there to give raises to the teachers' unions. They're there to build new schools, to pay off the unions that are running the town. And that's what they're there for. And they're there to make sure somebody like me doesn't get elected. Some teacher maybe who, heaven forbid, advocates for, not advocates, but maybe is a Republican, for example, in Duluth. Hey, the teachers are going to go after him. The union is going to go after him and try to destroy that person. And so that's why people are on the school board, is to exert their power and make sure that they can exert that and control things the way they want. They're not there for the children. I mean, it's such a laughable thing. And I wish people that would listen to this would realize politicians are not there for the children. They're not there for the future of our country. They're there for themselves, only for themselves.
Well, I know when I was running, the first time I was running, I had somebody criticize my sign because it didn't include the students. Everybody else's literature signs said that you're there for the students. Well, no, I said exactly what I meant on my sign. I was there to represent the taxpayers. And that's everybody that owns a piece of property, be it their home or their business. And that the red plan was diminishing their power because of all of the high taxes that were being collected to pay this big, enormous red plan. So I remember at one of the student forums, did they even have a student forum for the candidates this year like they used to do?
They haven't had a student forum, I don't think, for quite a few years. I think I went to one once the first time I got elected. I don't recall any since then.
Yeah. Well, I remember that, and that question came up, and I just basically answered like I'm doing right now. The taxpayers are paying for your schools. My representation is on behalf of the taxpayers, the voters in this community, which ultimately filters down for the benefit of U.S. students. And that was the end of that conversation. But these kids seem to think they can interject into your campaign what you should be saying. Well, I know what I needed to say. I didn't need somebody telling me what I needed to say.
Well,
I was supporting all the people in the community, not just the students, which are a minor portion of the community. I was representing all tax-paying citizens. So.
Well, just to add to that, I mean, when we would have people, once you file for political office, you begin all kinds of mailing lists, and we would get questionnaires from pro-choice people. I got a lot of them. Like, do you believe in abortion? And of course, they're advocating it for. And then in the last couple times we're getting these things, do you believe in transgender rights? And I thought, I was really appalled at that, because I was elected for a school board member. It had nothing to do with abortion. Don't want anything to do with abortion. It should not be part of the thing. But yet, these people, these special interest groups, and there's a lot of them out there, they try to force people into their thing. And unfortunately, there's a lot of weak candidates out there, which is weak, while they get elected, weak in the sense that they will pander to anybody, and they will say, oh, of course I believe in abortion on demand, blah, blah, blah. And of course I believe in that transgender boys should compete against girls. Of course I believe that. And But yet that should not be part of it. So you can always tell a politician when they're running, you can tell a bad politician, which is 90% of them, they will pander to every one of those groups. And they will actually answer these questionnaires rather than ignoring them. And we actually have questions. Now, let's go back to the students. It's nice, I'd like to say that, hey, that's really great. I'm glad the students are interested in politics. But remember, they don't even teach civics anymore in school.
No.
So most of them don't have a clue about our political system, the way a political system is supposed to be. There's a plan called Students for the Future.
Yeah, I remember.
And who were they? You knew who every one of their parents were. Because all they were was a front for their parents, for a front for the unions. They had zero independent thought. They were 100% predictable. Now that doesn't mean they didn't have a right to their opinion. Hey, we're all influenced by other people, but 15-year-old kids do not have a lot of ability to be independent from, say, for their parents. And personally, I think that is irresponsible for anybody to take young children, I'll say 15-year-old children, and put them to be a front for a political organization. I think that's totally irresponsible and wrong.
And that's exactly what they did when they wanted to pass their levies. They used small children in front of the cameras and showed them on their glitzy pages in the community education news about, these programs can't go on if these don't get the monies. And they used the children. And that,
it was propaganda,
to me,
100%.
It was propaganda, and it was below the belt. From whatever I saw in the past, it was really below the belt, all for the red plan. I was totally shocked and sickened by how they used our students.
Unfortunately, they're not given any real information.
No.
Nobody knew anything about that. Whenever I would try to speak, I was threatened to be sued. Of course, I was sued a couple times. But before I got elected, I was threatened to be sued for writing things about the red plan. There was no discussion in this community at all about that. But more in general, I think, political parties, the red plan is all part of the past. It's an unfortunate part of Duluth's past. But
the bottom line is
no political party should be using children to be a front for them, and it's irresponsible. And and every time I see parents putting their little kids up front saying something, it is irresponsible.
It's bad enough when you have an adult mouthpiece, but when you have a child who has no clue what they're doing except to do what their parent told them.
Yeah, it's all they get. They're only the sort of the information is from their parents,
yes.
Or in this case from their teachers, or from the principals that tell them what to do. And I think it's very sad. That's it's playing on emotions, which is another bad part of it. Luckily, we don't have that quite as bad on the national level, but getting back to the local level, it's pretty distasteful when that happens.
Well, I'm going to say this about PAC TV. The one thing that PAC TV did, in addition to my interviewing candidates, is they had all the candidates. They invited all of the candidates into the studio and filmed them and put it up on their channel so people could find out what those candidates were all about. The 710 Club had a candidate forum early on before the primary, and most of the candidates showed up to that. So, yeah, the Incline Station didn't hold that many people, but at least there was some effort on the part of the alternative portion of the community to get get the candidates so that the voters would know something about them. Now, 710 Club was going to do another voter info, but when they called all the candidates, they all said, well, we've been to too many and we're not going to anymore. So then 710 dropped the idea of having a candidate forum just before the general election.
Well, I think that's very sad. And getting back to the local elections again reminding the voters that 32% of the people voted the last eligible voters. 2 years ago, it was 28%. 28%, I think, was a record low for Duluth, if I recall, at the time. 32% sounds pathetically low, but it's probably about average for off-year elections when there's not a presidential or a federal office going on. But so what does that mean? That means, for example, Alana Oswald, who did win the school board election, she got elected by 16% of the eligible voters. Everybody that got elected in this election got elected by about 15 to 16% of the eligible voters.
Oh my goodness.
And was that put in the Duluth News Tribune article? No, they made some bogus article about people undervoting. Well, hey, if they would, any journalist that has a clue would have known there's been undervoting ever since there's been voting. But the important thing is Duluth is one of the lower voter turnouts or cities that I'm aware of. I mean, I'm not sure about that, but I think it's one. And I know that in the last election I went to some, remember I was a DFL person, and I went to a couple of groups and people would talk about they wanted to vote for Bernie Sanders or they wanted to vote for Jill Stein, the Green candidate. And oh my God, you should have seen, that people were saying, how dare you even think about voting for that because that's going to elect Donald Trump. Well, yeah, that's right, but don't tell me who I can vote for or can't. I mean, the pressure and the shaming of people is really amazing when it comes to political parties. Of course, that's why they're there, is to coerce people. But the thing I liked about Ralph Nader, which some of your viewers would take, is that I think we would get a whole lot higher voter turnout if we would have every ballot should have at the bottom, or at the top maybe it would be better, would be none of the above.
None of the below. Yeah.
None of the above, none of the below. And if you don't like none of these candidates, which almost none of us like any of these candidates, very few times, very rare that anybody votes for somebody. You vote against, you pick the lesser of the evils. And everybody knows that. What's everybody trying to pretend that isn't the case? Only people that are pretending that's not the case are the people that get elected. That, oh, look, I'm great. I'm such a great person. I won by 16% of the vote in the city of Duluth. They should be ashamed of that. It was not something you should be bragging about. It's not something you should take as a mandate and say, hey, I have all this power over you now, but I got 16% of the people voted for me. But if we had just try to imagine this, is that if we had an election and say on one election, let's take Alana Oswald and Joel Schwetman. If we had remember that was a big thing. There was that one, I think Alana Oswald got about 10,000 votes, Schwetman got about 8,000. And there was 2,000 people that didn't vote at all. This wasn't undervoted, they just didn't vote. They said, I don't want to vote for any of these people. Well, what happens if we would have had another box down there and said none of the above? I would say in most elections in our country, none of the above would win. And what would that do? First of all, it would cause total chaos, so we'd have to be really careful implementing that. But we would also force politicians to say that, hey, I have to be a good person. I can't just be a crooked politician, because somebody may vote for none of us. We know most of these people are all no good and corrupt anyway. I mean, everybody knows that. So if we have a none of the above, that would throw all these people, half of them would not be elected. Half of the people, politicians, there wouldn't be anybody elected in political offices. Half of them would not be elected anymore. And that would be the best thing that could happen, because it would force politicians to be honest, it would force them to be ethical, it would force them to be moral. And that's what we need. And why do people dislike politicians so much? Everywhere from the school board on up to the president, because they're all crooked. And they're all out for their own power. And people know that, and they don't want to vote for these people because these are all scumbags. Sorry, viewers, these people are. Anybody's been in political parties like I have been, some of the most nasty people that I know about are partisans. I'm sure you've seen that, Marcia. Most of our viewers, if you have an open mind, you'll know that these people go after somebody who doesn't toe the line. They go after them with a vengeance. They try to get them unelected. They go after their family, went after my wife. They did everything they could to destroy me, destroy her, and we were both part of the DFL. It's like, huh? It's sad. So if we had none of the above, none of these people would get elected, I don't think, and it would force the system to be better. So that's one of Ralph Nader's things, which I think is really good. And yeah, would it throw chaos in our country? Yes. There should be some chaos in our country because right now it's being ran by people who 77% of the people think that they're doing it for their own self-interest and don't think at all about the people. That's a high percent. When you get 16% of the people have respect for politicians, so that should be saying something for people. They'd be saying something that this is the most it's the most disliked occupation of politicians. Somebody should be really thinking about that. And instead of having these partisan peoples and saying all this kind of stuff, we all look at this stuff, we throw them all in the garbage, right? Who votes? Who is the 16% of the people that voted? The people that had a direct conflict of interest. The teachers, for example, they've run, when you have 16% of the people vote literally for the winner, that can be easily ran by any special interest group. In this case, in school boards, it's by the teachers. They elect everybody that's there. And nobody else makes any difference because you know the teachers have a stake. They want to get their 2% pay raise every year. They want to get their health insurance that has 0 co-payments and 0 premiums. They want to keep getting that. It's their amazing conflict of interest. And now we actually have 2 school board members. We've always had 1 or 2 school teachers, ex-teachers on school boards. And yeah, it's a free country. But somebody should really be looking at that and saying there's something wrong. When we're electing, the conflict of interest is so great, and it's very obvious there. They're not worried about the students, they're worried about their paycheck. And I don't blame people for that, but let's be honest for a change. And let's vote for none of the above.
And I think at that, unless you have any wrap-up, Art, we are pretty much covered our topics today.
We did, and we could talk for hours about this, and I hope some of the viewers listen to it. And but hey, thanks for being on. It gives a forum for somebody who's been in the belly of the beast, which is myself. I have an insight of what it's like to be in there, and I hope that people pay attention. I hope they get rid of political parties, all of nonpartisan races. I hope they start holding politicians to a very high standard. And and it goes both ways. I also wish that people would not force politicians. You have to abide by me and get their little stop forcing politicians to pander to every special interest group there is. I mean, it's a free country, but there's really something wrong with that. It just shows a lack of ethics and morality, and a lack of believing in diversity, which should be strong in our country, and is not at all.
Well, it all goes back to what's in a man's heart. If a man thinks more of himself than he does his neighbor, he's got it wrong from the beginning. And when he gets elected or she gets elected to a office of any kind, they're going to take that attitude with them, and that's what's going to guide them. It isn't going to be for the good of the people. And we have had good candidates run for offices, but like yourself and like my experience with the Duluth News-Tribune, they didn't want us, and they made sure that they let other people know that you don't want this kind of a candidate for office. They're more apt to tell the truth, which is not what's too popular out there today, and I think we can see that out in Washington.
Oh yeah, well, right in Duluth News-Tribune, they don't want any truth out there.
No.
They don't want to talk about 16% of the people electing people. They want to talk about, oh my gosh, some totally BS.
Yeah, we just want to talk. We just want to talk about
keep the status quo. Make sure everybody keeps having a little smiley face on there when we should be talking about opioid crisis. We should be talking about the poor graduation rates, the poor student achievement in our schools. That's the stuff we should be talking about. Overtaxing, lack of business climate in our community. Those things should be talked about, but none of that's talked about.
Well, let's hope in the future that we can see something come out of the ashes of this whole mess, rise up and start being opposition to the controlled media that's very rampant here in Duluth. Thanks for coming in, Art.
Thanks, anytime.
Great to have you again.